Good morning and welcome to you who are joining us by live stream. We do want to share together in a word of prayer as we begin, knowing that you probably have needs on your heart as well. We've shared some concerns here, and we want to take these matters to the Lord. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you've allowed us to gather to worship and to study your word. I do pray, Lord, that you would help us as we study together, that we'll learn things that can help us comfort and encouragement in their lives. For those that are sick, that you, for that which you'll do in meeting that need. So guide us now in the study of your word is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we're up to chapters 40 and 41 of the book of Genesis today, and we're looking today at the subject of revealed. Now, Genesis chapter 39 ended with another apparent downturn in Joseph's life. After serving faithfully in Potiphar's household, he gets accused of something that he did not do, and Potiphar puts him in jail, in a dungeon is the way some translations have it. Even Joseph himself, when he reveals himself to his brothers, will say that he has been in a dungeon. But it's a special prison for slaves and others of the royalty of that day. Even Pharaoh's butler and baker, we're going to see in today's lesson, are going to be put in jail. Joseph is of Potiphar's household, and he's in that same prison. But he's there, and he found favor in the prison warden, and was given privileges that you might not normally have. I consider the position he had was kind of like a trustee. If a prisoner today shows good character and shows trustworthiness, many times they begin to give them privileges or extra, freedom to a certain extent that others might not have, and we call them trustees. And ever so often, one of those trustees will go off the rail, and you'll hear about them escaping. I guess they say, well, I've got this much freedom, maybe I can go and get more, but that usually won't be a trustee again. So anyway, it doesn't pay. But in Genesis chapter 40, the scene changes, and we come to two of Pharaoh's officials being put into jail, the butler and the baker. Now, let me just begin with verse 1. It said, after this, that means Joseph is in prison because of being falsely accused of raping or trying to rape the Potiphar's wife. It said, after this, the king of Egypt's cupbearer and his baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. Captain of the guard assigned Joseph to them, and he became their personal attendant. And they went in custody, and they were in custody for some time. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each had a dream. Both had a dream on the same night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were in custody with him in his master's house, why are your faces sad today? We had dreams, they said to him. There's no one to interpret them. Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Now, there are only two men in the Old Testament who give interpretations to dreams. It's Joseph and Daniel. And both of them give God the credit for giving the interpretation to the dreams. Here's Joseph saying, don't the interpretations come from God alone? In other words, he's saying, look, they're saying nobody can interpret them for us. I don't know who all they might have asked in that jail. They might have told their dreams to somebody else to see if you got any idea what this dream means. And but Joseph said, look, don't interpretations belong to God? Then he says, tell me your dreams. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. In my dream there was a vine in front of me. And on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. This is the interpretation. Joseph said to him, the 3 branches are 3 days. In just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand the way you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well for you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. So the cupbearer has this dream. Joseph gives the interpretation that in 3 days he's going to be restored to his position as the cupbearer. Now the cupbearer in those days was the one who not only tasted the food, but he also drank from the cup that the king would be drinking from and the food that he would be eating from. You did this in order to make sure no one was trying to poison you. If you were the cupbearer, you were in a position that all could go well with you because you were going to eat some of the food that the king was eating, but it could go bad for you because if somebody was trying to take the king out, you were the one that was going to die. And he would live because you would go first, and then he wouldn't eat the food. So it was an important position, kind of interesting in how they did it in those days. He's not the only one who has a cupbearer. We know that when Nehemiah, when the Persian Empire comes into being, takes over as the world empire of that day, took over from the Babylonians as they defeated them, Darius, the king, had Nehemiah as his cupbearer. And, he's a trusted individual. And again, it's an important position. So he's given the good word that in 3 days he's going to be restored to his position. And he asked, don't forget me. Mention me to Pharaoh when you get back in his presence. I mean, everybody likes to have somebody that knows somebody. And in this case, this cupbearer is going to be right there with Pharaoh. And he says, would you remember me? I've done nothing that should get me put into this as a slave even. It must less be in prison. And see if you can get me out of here. That's what he's asking for. There's no chance of him ever getting out otherwise. And he thinks, look, maybe you'll remember me and it'll help me get out of here. There may be some other position that I can have in Pharaoh's household. So when that went well, verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was positive, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. 3 baskets of white bread were on my head. In the top basket were all sorts of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is its interpretation, Joseph replied. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off you. That's different from what he said to the cupbearer. He said to the cupbearer, let me go back up here and read it. He said, in just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. For this one, he says, in just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off you. That means you're going to lose your head. It's going to be lifted up, but not to be restored, but to be taken off, and hang you on a tree. Then the birds will eat the flesh from your body. Don't you know that was an interpretation he probably wished he had never heard? Can you imagine for the next 3 days wondering, first of all, they don't know if what Joseph has said is true or not. You know, does he really know? I mean, this is his interpretation. They don't know him that well. And is this going to come to pass? And if this is what happens, what in the world is going to, here's what's going to happen to me. Of course, once he's killed, he won't know about the birds eating the flesh off of his body, but just that thought for 3 days of what might be fixing to take place with you could be devastating to you. And as it turned out, on the third day, it says in verse 20, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he gave a feast for all his servants. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had explained to them. Yet, and here's the kicker in the very last phrase of chapter 40, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Joseph's only chance of getting out of there, as he saw it, was gone. Don't you know Joseph in that dungeon, waiting to see what's going to happen, having given the interpretations, and all he knows at this particular point is that these guys are gone, and he believes that what God has told him is what's going to take place. They're out of there. He's hoping and praying that the cupbearer is going to remember him, but he doesn't. He gets forgotten. And his chance of getting out of jail, because as he said, I don't belong here. I haven't done anything wrong. And his chance of getting out of there were ended as far as, well, he might not have thought of it as being ended, but didn't know if it would ever come to pass. Will I be remembered? We're told that he was forgotten. But for Joseph in prison, he's probably wondering, well, how much time is it going to take? Has he mentioned anything about me? You can imagine all kinds of things going through his head, because it's 2 years later before Pharaoh will then have a dream, and the cupbearer will remember him. But 2 years go by that he's still in prison. No one else out of Pharaoh's household have been put into that prison for him to be able to ask. If somebody had been put in the prison from Pharaoh's household, he could have said, well, look, tell me what's going on. Sometimes being there, you'd like to at least know what's going on the outside, so to speak. But it wouldn't have been anybody he could ask to find out what's happening. But then we come to chapter 41, and this is the focus of our lesson for today, is in chapter 41. And verse 14 begins our focus, but I'm going to begin with verse 1. It said, 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. Get this watch back up here. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing beside the Nile when 7 healthy-looking, well-fed cows came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. The sickly, thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, full and good, came up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 full, good ones. Then Pharaoh woke up, and it was only a dream. When morning came, he was troubled. So he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. So here's the situation. Pharaoh has these 2 dreams. Nobody else can tell him what it means. But verse 9 tells us, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I remember my faults. Pharaoh had been angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guard. He and I had dreams on the same night. Each dream had its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew, a slave of the captain of the guards, was with us there. We told him our dreams. He interpreted our dreams for us, and each had its own interpretation, and it turned out just the way he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and they quickly brought him from the dungeon. He shaved, changed his clothes, and went to Pharaoh. So here is the situation that gets Joseph. Don't you know, by 2 years prior to that? You know, sometimes if you remind somebody of something, oh, that's what happened, and it could bring back whatever the problem had been to start with that had gotten him in jail. It could have reminded Pharaoh of that, and it might have gotten him thrown back into jail. But when nobody else can interpret Pharaoh's dreams, the cupbearer comes forward and said, look, I'm guilty. I was told or asked to remember somebody to you when I got out, and let me tell you the situation. And he tells him about their dreams and how each came true just as Joseph had said the interpretation would be. So Pharaoh sends for him. He's a Hebrew slave. Now, we're told that in that day, had he come before Pharaoh, had a Hebrew come before an Egyptian unshaved, it would have been, a disgrace. It would have been a very bad thing. I used to think, well, they just got him cleaned up, from being in jail to come before Pharaoh. But there was more to it than that as you study it. Of course, that was part of it. But even more so, the fact that he needed to be shaved and cleaned up and given a change of clothes. I mean, you're not going to come as a prisoner before Pharaoh. You're going to be brought in at least clean and presentable before Pharaoh. And it quickly brought him from the dungeon, means that they hurriedly did this, even though it would have taken a little time to get him cleaned up. I don't know how long it would have been, but they were moving quickly because Pharaoh is greatly disturbed and troubled by the dream, and he's wanting to know if this young man can bring an interpretation for him. Now keep in mind, Joseph went to Egypt at the age of 17. We're going to find out in just a few minutes he's 30 years of age when he becomes second in command in all of Egypt. For 13 years, he has been in Egypt. 13 years, we don't know how to divide it between the time he spent in Potiphar's house before getting thrown into the dungeon and then the time that he spent in the dungeon. We know that the last 2 years of that 13 would have been in the dungeon because he had given the interpretation for the cupbearer, and 2 years he was forgotten. So that would be, you can say, 2 years of that was in dungeon, but more than that had been in the dungeon. We don't know. All we know is that there were 13 years that he had been a slave. 13 years in Egypt, part of that time in Potiphar's house, part of that time in prison, in a dungeon, and now he's going to be brought before Pharaoh. And he's 30 years of age at this particular point. And verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said about you that you can hear a dream and interpret it. I'm not able to, Joseph answered Pharaoh. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. As I said, he and Daniel both recognize that it's only God who gives the interpretation. He's just an instrument to be used of God. And So Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile when 7 well-fed, healthy-looking cows came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds. And after them, 7 other cows, ugly, very sickly, and thin, came up. I've never seen such ugly ones as these in all the land of Egypt. And then the thin, ugly cows ate the first 7 well-fed cows. And when they had devoured them, you could not tell that they had devoured them. Their appearance was as bad as it had been before. Then I woke up. In my dream I had also seen 7 heads of grain, full and good, coming up on one stalk. After them 7 heads of grain, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 full ones. I told this to the magicians, but no one can tell me what it means. So here is the dream being shared. There's one thing he added here that he didn't tell initially, and that is that when the thin, ugly cows ate the well-fed, fat-looking cows, it didn't change the thin cows. We're going to see the importance of that in the interpretation in just a minute. But, usually you'd think, well, if they were thin and poor-looking and they eat a lot, they're going to get fat and look better themselves. But that wasn't the case. Even after eating the well-fed cows, they still haven't changed in their appearance. And then Joseph in verse 25 gives the answer to the dream. Let me get back here to my notes. We know that the Nile River was the primary river in that region. Usually designates, when it talks about the Nile River, it usually included the canals that came into the Nile. They had and I understand still have an irrigation system that involves canals going off from the Nile to be able to catch the water in the time of the year when there's the overflow of the Nile, and they block that water to hold it in so that they can use it, because that was the best water source that they could have. And so you've got, this is the area which is a well-watered area, a very fruitful area, and yet you've got in that best area these thin cows that he sees in his dream. He also sees the 7 that are fat and full, and he sees the corn, the grain at least, and again you've got the 7 full ears on the one stalk, and then you have that is not so. It's been scorched by the east wind. An area that you would generally think would have plenty of water and have plenty it depicts it as corn. We don't know if it's corn or wheat fields or grain fields, just what. It's easier for us to envision corn as ears of corn on a stalk. If you've got 7 ears of corn on a stalk of corn, even in our part of the country today, you've got a good crop. And yet there were the sickly ears as well. So the good part would be typical of that region of the Nile. The bad part would be totally opposite, and you can see why that would be very disturbing to him, especially when the sick-looking cows eat the well-fed fat cows, and it doesn't change their appearance in any way. And so Joseph gives the interpretation, beginning with verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams mean the same thing. The 7 thin, ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 worthless, scorched heads of grain are 7 years of famine. It is just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. And then 7 years of famine will take place. And all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it, for the famine will be very severe. Because the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God, and he will soon carry it out. Now that's the interpretation of the dream. 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And the 7 years of famine are going to be so devastating that the 7 good years are going to be forgotten. That's the part of that dream where it said the 7 lean, sickly-looking cows ate the 7 fat ones and didn't change in their appearance. That's part of the dream, which says that the 7 good years are going to be forgotten. It's like they never happened. It is that this is what's the 7 years of famine are going to eat up the 7 good years, in other words, to the point that you don't even remember the 7 good years. It's not going to change anything. It's going to be very bad, very devastating for everyone. But Joseph didn't stop there. That's the interesting thing to me. Joseph was brought in to give the interpretation of the dream, or dreams, plural. And he tells him they're one and the same. They both mean the same thing. And because it happened twice, it means it's going to happen soon. It's going to start soon. And then he told Pharaoh what he should do about it. That's the part that's interesting to me. He came in just to simply give the interpretation. But God had revealed to him more than just the interpretation, but how to take care of it. It begins in verse 33 to say, "So now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all the excess food during these good years that are coming. Store the grain under Pharaoh's authority as food in the cities and preserve it. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by the famine." So he tells Pharaoh what he ought to do. That wasn't part of the coming in. He came in to give an interpretation. And he gives not only the interpretation, but also advice for what should be done because of this. And then the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all the servants. They thought, hey, that sounds like a good plan. Otherwise, what was Pharaoh going to do with the interpretation? He would have probably wanted to turn back to the magicians, but they hadn't been very helpful to start with, had they? They couldn't give the interpretation of the dream. The wise men had been called in. They had not been able to give an interpretation of the dream, so they wouldn't be very helpful either. So God has given Joseph not only the ability to interpret his dreams, but also given him a plan of action to be able to save everybody, to keep everybody from dying during the famine. During these 7 good years, take of the excess. Wasn't going to take what they needed to live on, take the excess, because these 7 abundant years you're going to have a crop and livestock over and above what you normally have. Take 1/5 of what the excess and store it in all of the cities of the country, and use that as a way of preparing for the 7 years of famine that are coming. And it was that not only would there be someone over it all, but then there would be overseers over the land to be able to take that feed. In other words, you're going to need overseers throughout the land to go and take this from the people during the 7 good years, to store it in those cities, in those areas, so that it could be uh, distributed back to them in the times of the famine. So there's going to be a need for a lot of people. And then when Joseph shared with him what he should do, it said the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all the servants, and then Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone like this, a man who has the Spirit of God in him?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as intelligent and wise as you. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "See, I'm placing you over all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him with fine linen garments, and placed a gold chain around his neck. He had Joseph ride in his second chariot, and servants called out before him. And it was the word abric was the word that they called out, and it was a word of honor that as they went in crowds of people, these who ran ahead would call out so that people would know, look, this is almost like Pharaoh himself. You've got to bring honor to him. So he placed him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your permission, no one will be able to raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zephanath Paneah, and gave him a wife, Asnath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, and Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. So his life changes, doesn't it? Goes from rags to riches in a couple of hours. Goes from a dungeon to second in command in all of Egypt in a matter of, I think, probably within a couple of hours. The time it would take to get him cleaned up, brought before Pharaoh, give the interpretation of the dream and the manner that God had given him of how they could prepare and get through this famine. And now he's second in command. There's a phrase, and I'm going to go back and mention something else, and Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Don't you know that having served as a slave for 13 years, and part of that time was a prison, he was ready to get out and go? I would be. I'd be wanting to travel. I'd be wanting to see something besides the prison walls and inside a prison, which was the last few years. And besides that, of course, he was in a privileged position in Potiphar's house because, God had blessed him, as we pointed that out, and things were going well, but he couldn't leave. He was there. Now he can go. And I'm thinking that guy was ready to stretch his wings out a little bit and see some things, see some countryside. Of course, he needed to go too because he needed to survey the land and needed to choose people in the various regions of the land who would be able to oversee that area to be able to collect the food for storage during those 7 good years. But I just think of it as, here's a guy who'd been confined too long. I mean, think about it. This guy was the spoiled brat. He was daddy's boy. He could do anything he wanted to do. Didn't have to go out to the fields to watch the sheep. Dad could just send him out there to check on him, and he'd bring word back to Daddy. And all of a sudden, he goes from that kind of privileged person to being a slave. And for 13 years, he's in confinement, we might as well call it. And especially when he got into the dungeon, he was in confinement, even though God was with him. And I remind us here that in those kinds of times, God doesn't forget us. There may be years that we wonder, where are you, God? And I would imagine for 13 years, those were long for him. For a teenager especially. A guy who's 17 years old, time travels faster the older you get, but when you're younger, it just seems to go so slowly. And I would imagine for him, it would seem like it drug on as he was hoping and praying for some kind of relief, especially after he got into prison and couldn't go anywhere, and was then forgotten for 2 years by the cupbearer before Pharaoh had a dream. But it's also interesting that a Hebrew cannot be leading Egyptian people. I mean, they wouldn't accept him. So Pharaoh changes his name to an Egyptian name. That's so that the people would be more accepting of him. He's not going to be known as Joseph to them. He's going to be known by this this Egyptian name that he's given. Also, Pharaoh gives him a wife. Wasn't of his choosing. I hope it was a good wife for him. You know, it was one of those arranged marriages, you could call it. Pharaoh arranged this one with the priest of On. Interesting thing here, that would be a pagan priest. And so Joseph has the daughter of a pagan priest as his wife. There are many scholars who believe that, having seen the hand of God working in his life, and as she gets married to him, and seeing all that God is able to do through him, there are many who believe that she came to faith in his God and became a God-fearer herself as well. We're not told that in the Scriptures. Quite possibly that happened, because we know that a godly influence can be very positive in the life of someone, and especially a husband with his wife, who, especially in those days, wife was almost considered like property of husbands in that culture. And for her to see that God was working with him could have very possibly caused her to want to be a follower of his God. Even though we're not told that in the Scriptures, there is that strong possibility as well. And Joseph went throughout the land. He was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph left Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout the land of Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced outstanding harvest. Joseph gathered all the excess food in the land of Egypt during the 7 years and placed it in the cities. He placed the food in every city from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it because it was beyond measure. But he knew that if he didn't store it up, 7 years of famine were going to be a long time as well. And so even though the abundance of that which was being stored became greater than what they could measure, it still needed to be done for the sake of the famine coming. And the famine, as he had given the interpretation, was going to be so great as to cause the abundant 7 years to be forgotten. I mean, they're going to forget all of this humongous amount that they're storing during those 7 years. 2 sons were born to Joseph before the years of famine arrived. Asnath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore them to him. And Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, meaning God has made me forget all my hardship in my father's house. And the second son he named Ephraim, meaning God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And then the 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began just as Joseph had said. And there was famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was food. Extreme hunger came to all the land of Egypt, and the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. And Pharaoh told all Egypt, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you," because the famine had spread across the whole country. Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. The whole world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe over all the earth. God used Joseph to spare not only Egypt, but the whole world itself came to get food from the Egyptians. And we're going to see as we get into next week's lesson how all of this fits in. I mean, that's part of the story. And it's an important part of the story of showing how God's hand was upon the life of Joseph. We're going to see the place of these two sons as we move forward as well, Ephraim and Manasseh. One, all of the past had been forgotten, is what his name meant. The other, God has caused me to be fruitful in the land where I am today. So the meaning of those two sons would be a constant reminder to him of that which had been put in the past and the blessings of God upon his life even now. And we'll see moving forward the meaning of that as his brothers are going to come get food. And that's, to me, the beautiful part of this whole story. But Joseph, still in a land where he's not known by anybody. He's going to be known now, though, as he's second in command. But he's a person who's like a fish out of water. He's not among his people, not with his family, doesn't even know what's happening to him. He goes from being in prison to being second in command and having to get ready for the 7 years of famine that are coming. So for those 7 years, it's going to be busy. And then, so he's going to be 37 when the famine starts. He's 30 years old when he's brought out of prison, put second in command in Egypt. You're going to have 7 abundant years before the 7 years of plenty. So he's going to be 37 years old now when the famine begins. We'll pick it up at that point next week. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the privilege of studying your word, and I do pray that we will learn things that can be valuable in our everyday life. And from Joseph, we learned the importance of remaining faithful to you in spite of the circumstances that are going on around us and even in our lives. You are faithful. You promised never to leave us or forsake us. You didn't forget Joseph. It was a time that we look back on and can say it was a time of maturing for him. But I'm sure that while he was going through it, it was a very difficult time that he couldn't understand and probably had cried out to you often, only to wonder where you were. Now he could see where you were, and now he could understand better. So help us in our times of difficulty to realize that so often you are at work behind the scenes that we cannot even see. And may we just keep trusting you and remain faithful to you, knowing that you're the one who's going to bring about the results and use us as you see fit. For we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for being here, and thank you all for watching on live stream. And I do pray that that you will stay on for our worship service today. This is Mother's Day, and we'll